All right, Tammy, good morning, everybody, or rather good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Tamina Ahmed, and I am the Managing Partner for Client Relations with Bradford and Barthel. I'm pleased to be here today, and we thank you for your time as well. We've done a few of these, and we appreciate the opportunity to spread this information. I've been with the firm for about 23 years this year, and I'm honored to have these colleagues present here today. Manjit is our next speaker up. I'm going to introduce her in a minute, but before I do that, you guys will want to get her autograph now before she makes it big on the silver screen, because she's got her SAG card and has been on Grey's Anatomy and other great shows as well. So take it away, Manjit.
Well, thank you, Tamina, for that. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Manjit Bath, and I'm the Assistant Managing Attorney in the Fresno office. As Tamina says, I do like to do some acting on the side when I have some spare time, when I'm not, trying to litigate these workers' comp claims and trying to do the best for my clients. I do cover Bakersfield, Fresno, and San Luis Obispo. As you can tell from my accent, I was actually born in England, went to law school in England, and I've been in California for about 20 years. I've been doing workers' comp for about 9 years and with B&B for about 8 years. I'm going to be assisting with questions, so if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the comment section, and I'm going to move it on to Brittany.
Thank you, Manjit. My name is Brittany Roth-Kushel, and I'm in the Los Angeles office, and I cover the LA, Marina del Rey, and Van Nuys boards. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon, and I too will be looking at your questions and presenting them and hoping we can get you the answers you need for your cases, and looking forward to meeting you all when we all can get our vaccines and meet in person. I'm going to hand it off to Don now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Don Barthel. I'm one of the founding partners of B&B. We're a statewide firm, and we have offices throughout the state. So we represented every WCIB district office. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Fascinating topic. Zane knows this stuff inside and out. I guarantee you're going to find it fruitful. I want to make a couple of offers of value-added services we provide. First off, we have a rating service that analyzes files to make sure that the doctors have properly applied the AMA guides, which they haven't about 82% of the time. About 80% of the time, they overstate the level of permanent disability. So we've done about 20,000 of these. And as a result, we have a little black book about all the doctors that we've reviewed, the good, the bad, the ugly. So if you're facing a panel and you don't recognize one or more of the doctors, or somebody's proposing an AME, and you, God forbid, are considering going to an AME, I have a problem with that. But if you're considering it and you need some background on that doctor or doctors, please give me a call, email me, text me. I'll be happy to get that information for our rating department. And additionally, since we have offices throughout the state, we can go to the managing attorney of the local office and get that information and get their opinions from the legal eagles in that particular office. Also, this webinar today, you get your continuation credits. This is not new to us. We've been doing these things for about a decade now, and approximately 50 of them have been recorded and are available on our website. So if you need some more CE credits or want to sharpen up on a particular point on the law, please go to our website, sign up for that, or just stream it. And once you've completed that, you're certainly entitled to your CE diploma. Everybody knows me for really bad jokes and really bad riddles, and I will not disappoint today. My really bad riddle is, did you hear about we hear what happened with the cheese factory that burned down? Are you ready? There was nothing left but debris. Oh, yes. All right. Well, you're in for a real treat here with Mr. Zane here. By the way, please congratulate him with me. He just recently became a partner this last year, and or this within the last month or two, and for real good reason. He's an integral part of our successful COVID task force, and this group has dedicated itself to keeping employers, TPAs, carriers, et cetera, the entire industry really up to date in the latest COVID changes, whether they be executive orders, statutes, regulations, case law, or the like. They've handled all kinds of COVID cases, from your basic COVID cases to multiple death cases, so they really know the insides and outs. He's presented dozens of these webinars and really knows what he's doing. So if you have any questions, by all means, during this. And oh, speaking of which, if you have a case that you'd like to refer on COVID, and or if you've got a question that doesn't get presented or addressed today, please go onto our website. There's an email address that's directly dedicated to these particular issues. It's covid@bradfordbarthel.com. Actually, all our emails are at bradfordbarthel.com. So it's covid@bradfordbarthel.com. All right. With given that, I guess without further ado, we'll have Zane take over. Mr. Zane, break a leg.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Zane Uribarri. I'm a partner in the Ontario office. And during today's presentation, which is going to be on vaccine injuries, specifically COVID-19 vaccine injuries, we would like you to submit questions. There is a method to submit questions through the meeting app itself. We'll be looking at those, trying to respond to them in sort of in real time, and then also answering some of them here as we go through the presentation. So please, if you do have questions, please get those in so that we can look at those and get those answered. But this afternoon, I'm going to go over a little bit about vaccines and sort of what some of the rules are regarding vaccines, what the law is in workers' compensation concerning vaccines and vaccine injuries. We'll be looking at exactly what a vaccine injury is, and some of the factual circumstances that need to exist for an employer to be liable for a vaccine injury and for a workers' compensation claim to exist. So this is something that's been generating a lot of buzz recently, and at times when we are looking at vaccines, or if you may have seen other presentations regarding vaccines, many of them are done by doctors, and they focus a lot on the medical aspects, which is very important. And we'll be looking at some of the medical aspects as well. But we also wanted to look at what the law is that governs vaccine injuries. And then what are the factual situations that would arise that would create liability for an employer and therefore create a workers' compensation claim. So that's a little bit, a few other things that we're going to be looking at as well. What are the ramifications for an employer maybe requiring individuals to be vaccinated? What if the employer simply suggests that individuals receive a vaccine? Or what if the employer simply doesn't say anything about vaccines at all? Is there liability that attaches there? So we'll be looking at the COVID-19 vaccines, those that have been specifically developed for COVID-19 and that have been approved by the FDA. Some of them are still in clinical trials, some are in late stages and may be ready soon. We do have 3 that are currently out, including the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which recently came out, which according to some is preferred, according to some is not preferred. We can kind of look at a little bit as to why that might be in terms of how effective they are and how many times you actually need to go get a shot. Some of the vaccines require, of course, intense refrigeration and are difficult to distribute. So there's only a few different sites that may be even equipped to distribute the vaccine. It's going to be a lot different than, say, a flu vaccine, which is distributed really anywhere, even at individuals' places of employment. So when we look at the benefits of a vaccine, what we're going to look at specifically are the benefits to the COVID vaccine. And in this particular case, many of the vaccines that are being developed for COVID-19 do not actually use the virus itself. So there is no live virus or there is no deadened virus that is being used. And that's a bit revolutionary. It's new. It's definitely a new type of science. So in these cases, the vaccinations for COVID-19, the vaccination companies actually just broke down the RNA of the virus itself, and they developed a serum that mimics the virus to the extent necessary to have your body generate antibodies when the vaccine is then injected into you. These antibodies then just allow you to fight off the actual virus without ever having contracted the virus itself. An important thing that we do want to remember is that clinical trials in the cases for these vaccines were quite extensive and lasted months and months. And we ended up with vaccines that have a fairly high effective rate, in fact, higher than the flu vaccine itself in some cases. Even those individuals that then had the vaccine later on, they had very, very reduced symptoms or were completely asymptomatic if they did happen to contract COVID-19. You may remember some prominent individuals that had the vaccine that later contracted COVID-19. They didn't even realize that they had it. And that just speaks to sort of the high success rate so far that we've seen from these vaccines itself. The actual development of the vaccine to prevent the spread of serious illness was quite incredible. One of the companies that did it, of course, they had to test for months and months in order to make sure that the vaccine was safe, but they actually developed the vaccine in less than a week. So that is an interesting little fact. Okay, vaccine injuries themselves. So when we talk about vaccine injuries, we want to clearly define what we're talking about. If an individual has been vaccinated, in our case, it's going to be very important to make a distinction between what kind of injuries are caused by a vaccine and what kind of injuries are just occurring even though someone has been vaccinated. So we need to know what is a vaccine injury in order to know what's going to be covered by workers' compensation insurance. So during the course of the presentation today, we're going to be looking at different types of vaccine injuries that can occur, including injection site injuries, which typically happen right after you've had the vaccination, and other types of reactions, such as allergic reactions that can occur from something that's in the vaccine itself to other larger systemic reactions that take place at locations other than the injection site. So we're going to look at those different types of injuries, whether those injuries can be attributed to the vaccine itself, and kind of try to navigate ourselves through this causation maze that we're going to have. See if there's any kind of guidance that we're going to get from the clinical trials and CDC documentation itself. And then ultimately, what's it going to come down to when a doctor evaluates a person and we have to have the doctor's opinion regarding whether or not a claimed injury is in fact something that is caused by the vaccine. So if an individual is claiming, say, pain in their wrist and they're attributing it to the COVID-19 vaccine that they received 2 days earlier, we do have to have some kind of causal connection between the wrist pain and between the vaccination itself. Just the closeness in time is really not going to be enough. We do some of this when you look at COVID-19 injuries themselves, and an individual has contracted COVID-19 and then they have a list of complaints that occurred after they had become ill. And we do want to make sure that when we look at those, that those are actually related to having COVID-19. And so in this particular case, we're going to be looking to see, is this injury that someone is claiming the type of injury that you would expect from a vaccination? So what is a vaccine? Just sort of definitional, as a definition, the vaccine is an agent that will stimulate your immune system to produce antibodies to fight off a virus. Vaccines are designed to prevent illness in the first place. They're not designed to either cure or treat any particular condition that an individual might have. The COVID-19 vaccine will not be helpful if you already have COVID-19. So it's purely a preventative measure designed to help individuals not become ill in the first place. What is not a vaccine? A vaccine is not a medication that will treat an illness. It's also not any kind of device that helps support bodily function. That will also not be a vaccine injury. If you're injured by, say, a ventilator in a hospital. And a vaccine is a very specific type of thing that is injected into someone in order to prevent illness. So it's not something like blood plasma, which might also be injected, which helps treat an ongoing current COVID infection. So it is just important to remember what is going to be a vaccine injury and then what is not going to be a vaccine injury as you go through and you look at a particular case. So we do currently have 3 vaccines that are manufactured by 3 different companies that have been approved for emergency use by the FDA. In other countries, they do also have other vaccines that have been approved as well, but these are the ones currently being used in the United States. So there's the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which were both approved right around the same time. They both require multiple shots within a certain length of time, which is still at this point a little bit under dispute as to what kind of time frame you're looking at. It was 21 days. Some health agencies are now saying 42 days is fine. Some health agencies in Europe are saying 6 months is fine. But these two particular vaccines, they have very cold storage requirements, and they do require 2 shots to be effective. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine does not have the same kind of cold storage issues, and it only requires a single vaccination in order to reach the maximum level of effectiveness. It is important to know which vaccine an individual received if they do file a claim, so that you know that if a particular reaction that they are having or a particular complaint that they're having is something that would come from that particular vaccine itself. Do we have a question?
Yes, Zane, we do. Someone asked, and I'm sure it's a common question, if an employee is feeling ill from a vaccine shot, does that fall under regular sick pay?
Well, I guess it could fall under regular sick pay in terms of when you're having someone be off. But the question is then whether or not, if they're off because they are sick, is that going to be something that is going to then be compensable through the workers' compensation system? And then in order to figure that out, we're going to have to kind of go through the analysis and make a determination. Is this a vaccine that the employer either required, that the employer benefited from, or that the employer sort of mandated or directed an individual to receive? So that's the kind of factual inquiry that we'll have to go through first before determining whether or not someone would just use sick time to be out because they went and got the vaccine on their own and then they became ill, or whether or not it was more employer driven and then might trigger workers' compensation liability. So we will be looking at that too as we go along. So when we are looking at specific vaccine injuries, we want to look at what the common side effects are. And these side effects have been fairly well documented through the clinical trials. They are listed on the CDC website. They have a number of charts and a number of graphs of the different types of injuries, the rates at which those injuries happened. It's broken down into columns with the percentage times that individuals reported that. And then it's broken down also based on each individual vaccine, and it is also, there is a separate column there for individuals that received a placebo, which is interesting because you can kind of compare sort of the general rate of individuals feeling ill after receiving an injection versus individuals that are ill after having an injection done that was the vaccine itself. So that is interesting in and of itself. So many of these were documented through clinical trials. We have the injection site injuries, which is sort of the pain and the swelling that you might, and some stiffness that you might feel where the injection actually is. And then you have injury that may occur throughout the rest of the body, which can be a host of different things that we will look at, but normally things like chills, fatigue, and headaches. As an example, though, of the kind of injury that you might see, but might not actually be compensable is, oh, I'm sorry, Tammy, do we have another question?
No, it's just poll time, if that's okay.
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, here we go. This is a more serious poll compared to our first one. You should see it up on your screen now. Our question for you today is, have you handled a vaccine injury claim? You just have 2 options there. You have or you have not. And I'm just going to give it a few seconds so you can all vote. Looks like most of you have. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can submit them through that question section on your go-to panel. And I'm going to close the poll. And I'm going to share the results. And Zane, it looks like 15% have and 85% have not. Wow.
That's quite a few, actually. 15%. That's quite a few actual cases. We do generally see, when we see vaccine injuries, they are normally being handled by the adjusters. They don't often become litigated unless they are extremely serious. But most of the time, we do see those kind of injuries not end up being litigated, whether it's a severe flu reaction or other vaccines, usually being done by healthcare providers at their particular facility. So that is interesting, though, 15%. I was talking about the types of injuries that can come from a vaccination itself. And this was an example of one going through clinical trials. There were about, of the tens of thousands of people that took the vaccine, about 7 of them developed an inflamed appendix and had to have their appendix removed. Ultimately, though, when the scientists and the doctors looked at the numbers, they determined that that number of people having appendicitis was exactly what you would expect to see in the general population itself. So appendicitis is not something that results from taking the COVID-19 vaccination. And we have another question.
Yes, Zane. So we have a question. Is there any available data as of yet as to the frequency of how often you should have the vaccine, whether just the one or, annually?
No, in terms of how effective the vaccine is over time, that is something that is being studied. It has been suggested that this will be something that we all have to get every year, just like a flu shot. Be that from how long the particular antibodies seem to stay in people's systems, or due to changes in the virus itself. As we know, there are multiple different types of COVID-19 that are out there. There's we in California, of course, have to have our own special version of California COVID, but also it does appear, especially from individuals who were infected with COVID-19 early on in 2020, that they no longer possess many of the antibodies that are necessary to fight off further infection. So they can become reinfected, especially if it is a different strain. So that is still being studied, whether or not there are going to have to be multiple vaccinations over time in order to kind of catch you up, such as like a booster shot, or whether or not there's going to have to be a complete separate vaccine each year itself. So that is still something that is being looked at and determined.
Thank you, Zane.
So before I get to the legal standards, though, I mean, I did want to kind of touch on the importance of the clinical trials itself and what they discovered when they were testing the vaccine and the kind of side effects that came out. Because we might expect individuals that had something like heart palpitations to be the kind of thing that would be attributable to receiving the vaccine. So is that the kind of side effect that they expected to find? And in large part, the answer to that was no. So much of this science has been done by the actual drug companies themselves. There's not a whole lot of independent outside evidence that could be brought in to say, well, these other injuries should also be considered injuries that are related to the COVID-19 vaccine itself, because there hasn't been a lot of study on that yet. So the important thing is that we make sure that the type of injury that we are looking at is the type of injury that comes from vaccine injuries themselves. So let's look at some of the legal standards here on what an injury is, what constitutes a legal injury, so that we know whether or not we even have an injury going forward. Injury is, of course, very broadly defined by Labor Code 3208, and an injury just includes very, very generally any injury or disease arising out of employment. So the central question here is whether or not the injury that comes from a COVID-19 vaccination itself is something that arises out of employment. And we are going to use this original definition of injury itself that comes from 3208. For those of you that do have COVID-19 cases, you will know that the definition of injury was changed by the presumption statutes that were passed. There is now a test to see if something is an injury, positive test within 14 days, and depending on the date of injury, there may be an outbreak requirement, and that redefined what an injury was. But for COVID-19 vaccinations, those don't fall under the presumption statute themselves. They are not a COVID-19 injury, so we go back to the original definition of injury itself. If you do happen to have healthcare individuals whose claims you are administering, or if you are a healthcare provider, there is a completely different section that applies to healthcare workers and defines injury as a reaction to or a side effect that arises out of care that is provided, including anything which is intended to prevent the development or manifestation of any bloodborne disease or illness. So this statute does kind of make these kind of treatments. If you're treating an individual as the healthcare provider employer, if you're treating your own employees for this, this is going to make it a work-related injury necessarily by definition. So that's sort of our really general definition, and we know now if it's an injury that arises out of employment, it's going to be compensable. So the question then became, what exactly does arising out of employment mean? So we've got that real general definition, and now let's go to the case law and see what we have in terms of whether or not something actually arises out of employment itself. So we go here to this first case of Roberts versus USO, and this is from the late 1940s. It's one of the original cases on vaccinations itself. And it is, in this particular case, this individual was a musician, a traveling musician. So he was hired by his employer to travel with a band. The employer required that a vaccine be received. The employer arranged for it and then paid for it. And the individual did have the vaccination. They developed an adverse reaction to the vaccination in the form of brain swelling, and then later made a claim against the employer for an injury. They filed a regular civil claim. And so this went through the courts and up through the Court of Appeal, who ultimately dismissed the case and said, no, this is covered by the workers' compensation exclusivity remedy. And that's an important thing for us to know, that this is something that is going to be covered by workers' compensation if it's determined to be work-related. And the holding in this particular case, the court looked at a number of reasons why it might be related to employment, but they specifically focused on the idea that the vaccination was required as a condition of employment, and it was being done for the benefit of the employer. So essentially, the employer doesn't want their traveling musicians to be falling ill and then unable to perform, and then the entire organization can't continue to run. So there was a benefit to the employer here, specifically in having individuals vaccinated. And we have another question.
Yes, hi Zane, just quickly, because I know you were talking about when an employer mandates an employee to take a vaccine. What is the case if a company does not mandate an employee to take a vaccine and they on their own elect to take it, and they end up sick due to an allergic reaction? The question is, why would an employer be responsible for a personal, sensitive or reaction to the vaccine?
And that is going to entirely depend upon the employer's level of involvement in the individual receiving the vaccine itself. So if you think about individuals that get a flu shot, where employers may have someone come into the place of employment and do flu shots. If it's something being arranged by the employer, it's something being paid for by the employer, done on work time, done on work premises, those are the kind of factors that are taken into account when determining whether or not this is a work-related injury. And then at that point, you do have to take the individual as they are. If they have a reaction, then that reaction is then work-related, even if it's a mild reaction, or it could in fact be a very severe reaction. But the focus is whether or not the injury that the person had, however severe it might be, whether or not that arose out of employment. So the employer's level of involvement is going to be something that we're going to look at. In this first case, this was a requirement. This was something that was mandated, and it was required that it come out. But some of the language here that the court also uses in the holding, they say that the treatment is submitted to pursuant to the direction or for the benefit of the employer. And that's really where we start to look at, well, what was the employer's intent when it came to their employees becoming vaccinated? Was this something that the employer directed their employees to do? Or was this something that was being done for the employer's benefit? And that almost becomes our litmus test there. And we are looking now to see what the employer's involvement is in an individual becoming vaccinated. So that was our first initial case. That kind of gives us this ground rule, if you will. Of course, if it is mandated by the employer is going to be liable for it. If it's done at their direction, which means that they organized it, they coordinated it, or if it's done for the employer's benefit, and of course that's going to be very fact specific, then these are the kind of things that give rise to liability. But then let's move on. We're going to move a few decades ahead into the 80s, where we get to a California Supreme Court case. going to carry a little bit more weight coming from the California Supreme Court. But this is an interesting case. The employer will be liable for an injury sustained as a result of treatment that is required as a condition of employment. In this particular case, this was an individual that had a test for tuberculosis. They ended up testing positive, so there were a number of medications that they had to take, and then there were some side effects from those medications that caused complications. And the question was whether or not this was going to be work-related. And the holding was yes, since the test was a work requirement and there was an employer benefit from the test. And in this particular case, the employer benefit was the specific type of work that this individual was doing. You didn't want them to have tuberculosis and be spreading it to others. But some of the language that's in the case is interesting. If the employee submits to an inoculation or vaccination at the direction of the employer and for the employer's benefit, any injury resulting from an adverse reaction is compensable. And that is sort of a repeat of what was already said in the Roberts case. But now we start to see this foundation develop, that we do have to have something that is done at the direction of the employer, or it is being done for the benefit of the employer. And this is a good example. This case, since it was the tuberculosis case, is an example of something that was being done for the benefit of the employer because of the chances of spreading it to other individuals who were not just other employees, but essentially other customers that were working and that this person would come into contact with. So that was another concern that was taken. We'll come back to this case also because this case also has some other interesting language in a bit that is we're going to find helpful. But sort of starting here where we're starting to see benefit to the employer or at the employer's direction, we speed forward here into the late 90s into the St. Agnes case, a little bit more of a modern case. And now we're looking at a case where an employer may be liable for injuries that were sustained as a result of treatment that was completely optional. So this was preventative care that was provided by the employer, not necessarily a condition of employment at all. So this is something that the employer said was completely optional for the employees to have. The individual in this particular case received a flu shot, and they had a negative reaction from the flu shot, and they filed a claim. So the flu shot was actually provided by the employer, and it was provided for the employer's benefit in that this individual worked at a medical facility. They did not want the employee to get the flu and then spread it to other patients. So we start to see that as an employer benefit, the idea of not spreading a condition or disease to those who you might have responsibility over, such as patients. We're seeing this repeatedly in these cases. We have another question. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, this question was asked more than once, so I figured it's probably common questions and inquiry. So the question is, in one or more forms, will employers be mandating that employees be vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine before returning to work?
There are some employers that certainly can make that a requirement. We have seen from the federal law side that that is a requirement that could be made. We're not seeing it though. By and large, employers that I am talking to, that others here are talking to as well, we are not seeing a requirement that there be a vaccine of any kind. In fact, many times employers are just saying the vaccine is available, check your local listings kind of thing. They're not really being overly encouraging in order to, have people actually go out and get it. Certainly really not seeing it mandated. Interesting, even some larger medical facilities, even facilities that have lots of COVID patients, they also don't require their employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19. So it's not something generally that we're seeing. Was that the question itself?
Yes, it was. Thank you, Zane.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure I got that. Yeah, we're not seeing a lot of requirements. Definitely very different than we've seen other types of illnesses dealt with in the past, or where vaccinations might have been required for different conditions, polio vaccine, for example. So we're not really seeing the requirements as we had been seeing in the past. So on the St. Agnes case, we see that this is something that was optionally provided to the employees. That was not something that they were required to do. It was something that they completely had optional, but the employer still provided it. The employer either provided it at their location, they paid for it, they arranged for it. And so when we see that kind of employer level involvement in getting the vaccination, then liability is more likely to attach. Was there another question?
Yes, there was a
Sure.
follow-up, again, multiple questions on the same topic. On that same note, if an employer mandates employees to get the vaccine and employees refuse and the employer fires them, is that unlawful? Is that something that the employer has a legal right to do to protect the company?
And right, and that's going to take us largely. That'll take us largely into the area of employment law, we have to look at the reason why the individual did not want to have the vaccine done. There are many cases where individuals do not want to be vaccinated due to religious reasons, and if they told their employer that and then they were terminated, there would be a fairly basic and straightforward FEHA claim for wrongful termination due to their religious beliefs. So those can definitely arise. There can also be legitimate circumstances where some employers are going to have individuals vaccinated for a variety of reasons. We're not seeing a lot of that, and the factual circumstances that would be surrounding that would probably be fairly unique. As to why, and one example that was brought up, which seems silly, but may not be, and when you think about it, is would you require astronauts to be vaccinated so that you didn't have a situation where you launched people into space, and then you get 3 people up in the space station, and one of them all of a sudden a week later has COVID? That becomes a real problem. They're not going to be able to treat themselves. They're going to spread it to everyone else because you can't socially distance in space. But that was just an example of a situation that might arise. Or an employer might have an overwhelming interest in making sure that people that are vaccinated. But as we're seeing, even in hospitals where COVID patients are being treated, there is not a requirement that the individuals that are working in those units absolutely be vaccinated. They may be encouraged to do it. The employer may be offering it to them. But there is not just an out-and-out mandate at all the facilities in California that if you're treating COVID patients, you have to be vaccinated against this. So this is very much a voluntary thing that is going forward from the employee side, which does make it a little bit more interesting when it comes to figuring out if a workers' compensation case exists, because we've taken out mandated vaccine completely out of the equation. And now we're just looking at, did the employer direct this, and did the employer get a benefit out of having this particular vaccine done? So that's really where our analysis comes down to. That's what we're looking at. We're looking at the employer's direction, such as setting up the vaccine as they do with flu vaccines at your place of employment and directing you, hey, you can get it here, I'll pay for it, I'll arrange for it, or being done for the employer's benefit because they have some benefit above and beyond not just having sick employees. So that's sort of a quick look at the legal side and what we'd be looking at from a legal perspective. Let's go ahead real quick and look at injection site injuries themselves. These are common specifically in the COVID-19 vaccine itself. Redness and swelling were very low at 5%. Pain was at 83%, which means 5 out of 6 individuals had some kind of injection site injury as a result of having the vaccine. So the fact that people will say that, yes, I had pain, I had an injury or something, we should really expect that because most people are going to have some kind of pain. Whether or not that translates into an injury, though, is going to be different. Yes, Manjit?
Okay, quick question. So if an employee can provide proof of vaccination in order to return to work, what is the legal certified acceptable criteria for the vaccination? Meaning, does each pharmacy or each site have their own card per se that they give each individual to carry, basically showing proof that they've been vaccinated?
Well, vaccinations are currently being recorded. They're being recorded at the site, but then they're also being recorded on documentation that the individual has who has actually been vaccinated. So if the employer was requiring something like that in order for an individual to return to work, then you would be either obtaining that information from the actual location itself where the vaccination was done, or the card certifying that the individual had actually received the vaccine. We're seeing that in other countries. They've talked about the idea of a vaccine passport, but I would be very hesitant to say that that is something that would happen here and in this case. If you think back even just to the new regulations that Cal OSHA issued about 2 or 3 months ago regarding COVID-19 itself, you can't require a negative test for an individual to return to work if they have been out sick. So requiring an individual to have proof of vaccination before returning to work is going to be something that's going to be unlikely, unless this is a case that we're talking about where someone must be vaccinated and then they are required to be vaccinated, in which case they're going to have that documentation and they'll be able to point to the site where they received the vaccination, and that place will also have a record because they do take down your information when you receive a vaccination. So looking here at the other types of reactions that you can have, some individuals do have an allergic reaction to one of the components that's in the vaccine itself. So either the liquid that it's suspended in or some part of the fluid, there's something in there that gives them some kind of allergic reaction. The CDC lists the type of reactions that you can have and how those are usually dealt with. It's usually some kind of anaphylaxis that can be mild, moderate, or severe. It is interesting to note, though, that allergic reactions that happened in individuals that were vaccinated also happened in individuals that were injected with a placebo. So it does seem like the allergic reaction may be just a reaction to something being put into you and not necessarily per se from this particular vaccine. And then looking at the systemic reactions that you can have, these are the type of reactions that don't just occur at the injection site and don't occur immediately. So this is not a reaction to the vaccine itself. This is something that the vaccine is doing overall to your body that is causing some other type of pain or injury. And these are listed for different age groups. But it is interesting to note 77% of this particular age group, ages 18 to 55, had at least one of these complaints, which means that people are going to have these complaints. It's not going to be abnormal to have injection site pain. It's not going to be abnormal to have fever, fatigue, chills, headache, some kind of muscle pain. This occurs after the first dose of either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. It can be worse after the second dose, but typically these are the kind of numbers that we see. But we also see these symptoms resolving themselves very, very quickly, usually within a couple of days. And that's another important thing to keep in mind. Just because you may have had muscle pain or joint pain after you had an injection, if it's then gone, you're not going to have any kind of resulting long-lasting injury. You had a reaction, it was a mild reaction. And it's not going to be something that's going to rise to the level of we're going to be worried about this person being on TTD a year down the road, which we definitely want to avoid. Some systemic reactions themselves were determined to not be related to the COVID-19 vaccine at all. There were some aggravations of the lymph nodes that were not, some cardiovascular incidents. Those were studied in detail. Different ones were not, which is the nice thing about clinical trials because they've already gone through this with tens of thousands of different individuals. And then a case of Bell's palsy was also determined to not be related to the COVID-19 vaccine. Bell's palsy has been in the news related to vaccines recently, and whether or not individuals end up having this as a result of the vaccine or not. And it is interesting because what the studies found is that the rate of Bell's palsy happening in individuals that have been vaccinated was the same as what's known as the background rate in the general population. So it's the same as with the appendicitis earlier. It's the rate that we would expect individuals to have this condition, whether or not they were vaccinated. So if we just expect on a particular day for 2 individuals to develop this condition, and then we vaccinate everybody in the state and 2 individuals have this condition, it's not something, according to the medical professionals, It's not something that arises out of the vaccine itself. So we do want to make sure when we're looking at a particular case that we have medical evidence of a particular injury, how the vaccine itself contributed to the injury, and how the vaccine itself actually caused that injury. So you're going to have medical evidence of that, especially if someone has filed a workers' compensation claim related to a vaccine injury. This is something that you're going to want to ask a doctor, either the treating doctor or a QME, and ask them specifically to cite the medical literature, cite the journal articles, cite the studies, tell us why this person's particular complaint that they have is related to a COVID-19 vaccination. Doctors are not going to be able to use the excuse that they use in back injury cases where they say, well, in my 30 years of experience, this is what I've seen, because everyone has right now the same level of experience with these vaccine injuries. We've all got about 3 months. So there is no vast history that they can sort of vaguely draw from and then say, no, I think that this injury is something that comes from a vaccine injury. No, they're going to have to point to something scientific. And right now, the clinical trials are really what we have. So, and that's listed on the CDC website that we would be able to see. So that would also help us in determining whether or not a case should be disputed, or whether a particular claimed injury itself should either be denied or disputed based upon a causation problem. So that's something that you want to go through with the QME, exactly like you would with your regular COVID claims. You can't accept all body parts when an individual has COVID-19. There has to be some kind of medical connection. COVID is a disease of the respiratory system. And so if someone's complaining about knee pain due to COVID, it's going to be the same kind of problem if they complain about knee pain due to the injection. There's going to need to be some kind of medical connection there. So then what are the circumstances under which an employer would then become liable for a vaccine injury? And we want to kind of look at what the employer's level of involvement is, because we were looking before, the legal standard was this being done at the direction of the employer, or was it being done for the benefit of the employer? So how involved was the employer in setting up the vaccination? Did the employer pay for the vaccination? Did the employer set up the appointment? Did the employer arrange for the location where the employees would go to be vaccinated? Did they arrange for the vaccine to be provided on site? And these are the kind of things that you would look at for any vaccine injury if it was the flu, but the legal standard is the same for COVID-19. And it's an interesting thing to think about, because in California, none of those things are controlled by the employer. The employer doesn't get to set up where the vaccine happens. Those are done at particular sites that have been designated that are provided with the vaccine, and they have to have special conditions such as refrigeration, but the employer doesn't have any control over that and can't actually have the vaccine done at the employer's location itself. The employer also doesn't pay for the vaccine. The vaccine is being paid for by the federal government. So that's one area where control also doesn't seem to exist. And also, as we saw on the prior slide here, does the employer set up the appointment for the vaccine, or were they instrumental in allowing this employee to get the vaccine? The employer doesn't have any ability to control that currently. Individuals are put on a list based upon certain criteria, age, health, type of job that they have, but really the employer doesn't have the ability to control that at all. In fact, if your employer required you to have a vaccination, but you didn't meet the government qualifications to receive it, it would be impossible to actually go out and receive the vaccination itself. And this kind of gets us back around to some of the other case law that I was talking about earlier from the Supreme Court case, that Maher case that I said we would come back to. When in that case, as they were talking, they have this great quote, and they said, if the requirement of the test or inoculation applied to everyone regardless of employment, for example, if everyone were required to have a smallpox vaccination during an epidemic, no special work connection would exist. This is extra language that the court put in to explain their decision and to explain their particular holding. But this is very, very interesting language, because this is the exact situation that we are facing now. It's even more than an epidemic, it's a pandemic, and the court is essentially saying this back in 1983, that there would be no special work connection that would exist. And so I would encourage you, as you look at particular cases when it comes to vaccine injuries, really look at the employer's level of involvement in having their employees get vaccinated. Now, there are healthcare providers that provide the vaccine to their employees, and they do it directly, and they do it at the place of employment, and liability there will attach. In that particular case, it's being done at the direction of the employer for the benefit of the employer, and the employer is actually providing it at the place of employment. There are other employers that are able to allow employees to have the vaccine done. Perhaps they are a site that is doing vaccinations, and then at the end of the day, they end up having extra that are left over. Some employers will go ahead and allow employees or other workers, other volunteers, or even members of the public that are standing in line to get vaccinated. And so in those kind of situations, if the employer is providing the vaccine themselves, then there's going to be some liability that attaches. Remember, that's largely going to be healthcare providers. So it's going to be it does need to be a very fact-specific investigation if you receive a vaccine claim as to what did the employer do that is having workers' compensation liability attach now. Because it's not like the flu vaccination where the employer can encourage you to go get it and can set it up and can offer to pay for it and things like that. This is largely out of the employer's hands. So I would just encourage you to look carefully at these cases as they come in. Also want to see what kind of statements the employer may have made about being vaccinated. If they maybe expressed no opinion at all about being vaccinated, then there's really not going to be a large connection to employment. If they didn't express, or say that they wanted their employees to get vaccinated, and they certainly weren't setting up appointments for employees or paying for it. So that is something else to consider when trying to determine whether or not these are going to be work-related injuries. I have had this question, so I did include it here. Can requiring the vaccine rebut a claim that you have an injury due to COVID-19? And some of the early opinions from other states and from the feds was it's possible, actually, this could be used to show that you could say, well, you were supposed to be vaccinated, and so you shouldn't even have this injury. And while that may work in other states, that's not going to follow the statutory language that exists in the new labor code presumptions. Those presumptions apply if you're ill. There's nothing about the presumption not applying just because you did not get a vaccine. I would not in any way rely on that. I know that has happened in one other state where they say if you could have been vaccinated and declined and then became ill, you're not going to be able to recover anything. Whether or not that holds up in the other state, that's fine, but in California, I would not expect that to. Really quick, did want to touch on what is known as the dual capacity doctrine, which is healthcare employers that provide care for their employees themselves. So if you're a healthcare employer and you are providing the vaccination for your employees, workers' comp exclusivity is going to apply. So even though you are a healthcare provider, normally that is held to a certain standard when treating patients. When those patients are your employees, you're acting in this sort of dual capacity, but workers' comp exclusivity is still going to apply. And then finally, if you do receive claims for COVID-19 vaccination injuries, it is important to remember that if you find that a claim shouldn't be accepted, there was no employer involvement, no encouragement, nothing that would trigger workers' comp liability, when you deny it, you may want to refer individuals to other resources where they can get some kind of recovery. There's the National Vaccine Insurance Compensation Program, which does not cover COVID, but it's the main one that everyone knows. But the one that does is the Countermeasures Insurance Compensation Program. It is the one that can apply. You can file a claim for specifically a COVID-19 vaccination injury through that program and receive some kind of compensation, medical treatment, and they may even pay some lost wages. So that is an important thing to remember. It's a resource that can be offered to individuals that have denied claims. They have another possibility of recovery. And sometimes if you offer them something else, then they may be less likely to try to bring that claim forward or even litigate that claim. Another question?
Yes, there are many. This one specifically addresses if someone dies after receiving the COVID vaccine shot, mandated by the employer. So if that happens, what would be the recommendation to protect against a legal claim? And would this now be an OSHA death recordable case?
I would want to look at the OSHA regs first on that, because it is very unlikely that the injection and death actually occurred at the employer's place of employment. So I would want to look at that first. But yes, if the employer is going to mandate the vaccine and then you're going to have the vaccine, then that would be a work-related injury, and then the employer is going to have to take whatever that particular injury is. Of course, you can challenge nature and extent, but if the individual does die, and it's medically determined that the vaccine was the reason that they died, or at least 1%, then some liability there is going to attach. It is important, though, to remember that there has to be a connection between the reason that an individual died and getting the vaccination. So one example that I use is if you get the vaccine and 2 days later you get rear-ended in a car accident, the injury in the car accident, not related to your COVID vaccination. So it's not something that would be compensable. So that is something that has to be looked at, though, as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Any others that we could run through real quick? Or I think we're actually out of time, aren't we, Tammy?
We have a minute. I mean, if you wanted to, if they had another question, we could probably answer one more. Brittany, Manjit?
Okay, yeah. This is a quick question. What if the employer provides a vaccination but doesn't actually require it?
So, and that would be something that would be exactly like the St. Agnes case that we looked at earlier, where there was no requirement to get the vaccination, but it was optional. So it was something that was being provided by the employer, completely optional. One of the cases that's in the case law, there was actually some kind of health fair that was going on, and flu shots were just being given out if you wanted them, but there was no requirement that you get it. But because it was being done by something that the employer had organized and that the employer had directed, then that is where liability then attached. So you would have something very similar going on in a situation where the employer didn't require it, but they were able to provide it to you. You know, some of the injection sites do end up having leftover vaccines, which they're able to give out, and they'll give them out to their employees, and that is where liability would end up attaching.
Thank you, Zane. Thank you for leading today, and thank you, Manjit and Brittany, for monitoring the questions. I hope you all stay healthy, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Take care, and thank you so much for joining us today.